Hey guys, Philosophossum. So anyways, I was working on a video the other day when I noticed something rather peculiar. My YouTube notifications were blowing up. I had 20 notifications at once. Now I'm a small YouTuber, I have less than 200 subs. So for someone like me to get that many notifications at once was a bit odd. I'll usually at most get 3 or 4 notifications at once, so this was definitely something out of the ordinary. Well, it turns out all these notifications were because one of my videos on masks was getting flooded by angry comments. Now this isn't anything new for me, mind you. I'd have the occasional troll stop by and shitpost in my comment sections before. I mean, it's a well-known fact that there are simply retards out there that feel the need to make an ass out of themselves for whatever reason. It's something you just kind of accept when you go into this line of business. But they'd usually come by once in a while. I'd never get them all flooding into a video at once like this. Well, after doing a little bit of sleuthing, it didn't take me too long to figure out what the source of all these angry comments was. Yeah, those of you following my channel will probably recall I made a video in response to Professor Stick not too long ago, in which I was defending some of Computing Forever's arguments on Facemasks. Well, it turns out Stickboi here saw the video and decided to make a response to me. The video, funny enough, is entitled "A Rat Responds to Me on Facemasks." Yeah, he thinks I'm a rat. I'm actually a possum. Yeah, the guy who can't tell the difference between a rodent and a marsupial is gonna lecture us on biology. Yeah, this should be good.
Hello my beautiful friends. So the other day I found a video where a small YouTuber responded to me on one of the responses I made to Computing Forever. I figured that responding to someone who responded to me is more entertaining in terms of content. Does anyone else feel that way, or is it just me?
No, I agree. I think it is more entertaining. But there's another advantage I do see to making responses to responses made to you, and that is it's a way of showing your intellectual honesty. It's a way of showing people that yes, I am willing to address criticisms of arguments that I've made head on and not avoid them. Or at least it can be.
So yeah, let's do this. His video is almost 30 minutes long, and if I responded to the whole thing, then the length of the videos will just keep creeping upwards. So I'm going to try to cut out as much of Computing Forever as I can, and we'll just respond to, say, the first half.
So he says he's only responding to the first half of the video, but one thing that I found rather peculiar is that he has a tendency to kind of jump around. He addresses some arguments from the first half and some arguments from the second half, in no particular order. Now this may seem like a minor nitpick, but it is actually important for reasons we'll get to later in the video.
And of course, this guy makes a lot of useless and not so good comments, so we'll be cutting out those too.
So right off the bat, you can see we've got some intellectual red flags here. What immediately stands out to me is that we've got some poisoning the well going on here, dismissing a lot of what I have to say as useless and not so good before even getting into it. For those of you who aren't aware, poisoning the well is a logical fallacy where you try to plant a bias against your opponent in your audience before you actually get into the arguments. But what really raises a red flag here from an intellectual standpoint is that he's basically admitting that he's filtering out what I have to say. Now me personally, when I make response videos, I try to include as much of the original video as possible, just so that nobody can accuse me of misquoting or taking anything out of context, which are things that are rather easy to do, even unintentionally, when you start filtering the original arguments. Now of course, Professor Stick here doesn't have to respond to every single argument that I make. You don't have to respond to every single point that a person brings up when you're responding to a video. You can choose to only address certain points that interest you. But if you're going to do that, you have to be careful, because if you leave out context that's important to the point that the person is making, you could very well end up attacking a straw man rather than that person's actual argument. And this is the biggest problem I have here with the approach that Professor Stick is taking. I'm not criticizing Professor Stick for not responding to the entire video. He doesn't have to argue against every single point that I make. If he wants to selectively address points that interest him, I'm cool with that. My problem is that a lot of the times, and you're going to see this in the video, he's going to remove context to make it seem like I'm arguing something that I'm actually not.
Of course, if you want the full context, the original video is always linked in the description. Alright, let's do this.
I likewise will put a link to the original video he's responding to down in the description. I actually suggest you watch it before you watch this video, just because it puts all the arguments that I make in their full context, so that you'll see exactly how it is Professor Stick is taking them out of context.
Symbol of submission to the new regime.
Yeah, face masks are a dehumanizing symbol of submission.
They weren't always that way. It wasn't until the left wing tried imposing them onto everybody that people suddenly started seeing them as symbols of oppression.
I don't understand why people keep trying to make this a political issue. It shouldn't be. If you say the left, you are creating a sense of us versus them. Now, I don't want to make this political at all. It's a public health issue. It concerns every single one of us. And the last thing you want to do is generalize.
You know, the funny thing is, a lot of people have been accusing me of making this a political issue, for pointing out that a lot of the advocacy for mask wearing is coming from the left. And well, let's be honest, it is. And I'm not saying that mask advocacy is solely coming from the left. I'm aware there are conservatives and right-wingers who also advocate for masks. But let's be honest, an overwhelming majority of the mask support is coming from the left. And an overwhelming majority of the mask criticism is coming from the right. When you look at the people who advocate for masks and the people who criticize masks, that's how the demographics of it play out. Now, just because I'm pointing that fact out doesn't necessarily mean I'm trying to make this a political issue. As a matter of fact, the honest truth of it is that I'm actually trying to depoliticize it. I'm trying to make it not a political issue. I want to get the government out of this issue. I think the decision of whether or not to wear a mask should be an individual decision, not a political decision. People should decide for themselves whether or not they want to wear a mask. They shouldn't have the government make that decision for them. I mean, I'm a libertarian. I think the government should leave people the fuck alone. If there's anyone who thinks issues should not be made political, it's me. Most importantly, though, he doesn't really address the main point I was trying to get across there. The point I was trying to make there was that masks only became a symbol of authority or oppression or obedience or whatever once they began being forced onto people. Now, in the video I criticized the left specifically, but it really doesn't matter what group it is that's trying to force the masks onto people. Anytime you try to force the masks onto people, they're not going to like it. They're going to push back. You'll have much better luck getting people to wear masks if you convince them to do it voluntarily, and that's the main point I was trying to get across there.
In certain places, such as grocery stores or public transportation vehicles where people can be in very close proximity to each other, we can reduce transmission significantly if everyone wears a face mask.
Well, sure, I'll agree that there may be certain locations where there may be a higher risk of transmitting the virus, and perhaps you could make an argument to justify mandating masks in those particular locations. The problem is a lot of places are mandating masks across the board, not just in these particular locations.
So yes, of course, in certain places with higher densities of people, such as public transportation or grocery stores, masks are absolutely necessary, because these are prime areas in which COVID is being transmitted. I'm glad you at least somewhat agree. Now,
you know, the funny thing about this is that even though there's a part of the video where I do outright agree that, yeah, in certain places where there's a higher risk of transmission, you could justify requiring masks in those particular areas, even though I'm on the record outright saying that, people are still in the comments accusing me of being an anti-masker.
Now, regarding enforcements of wearing masks in general when you're outside, I still think it is worth it.
Well, great. If you think it's worth it to wear a mask outside, go ahead and wear a mask outside. I'm not going to stop you. The problem is you want to force other people to against their will. That's what I have a problem with. And is it really worth it to enforce wearing masks everywhere outside? Because even if masks really are as effective at blocking the virus as you claim that they are, the government doesn't really have the resources or manpower to monitor every single person 24/7. Because you'll often hear people make the argument, we need mask mandates, we need a government to force people to wear masks in public. But like, what's your plan to actually enforce this? Because I've actually talked to some police officers about this before, and what they're telling me is that their department's plates have been full even before the pandemic started. Because now police departments are having to enforce all these COVID mandates and orders on top of dealing with the crime they already have to deal with. And with the economy not being as productive as it is ordinarily, there's less tax revenue for you to work with. So not only are you expecting the government to juggle more tasks, but you're also expecting them to do it with less resources.
Because even if the area is not crowded, you still come into close proximity with other people. If you stand within 6 feet of another person with COVID for a significant period of time, you are, by scientific definition, exposed.
Could someone point me to like a study or a source on where the 6 feet number comes from? Because I've been hearing this time and time again since day one of the pandemic. Keep 6 feet apart, stay 6 feet apart, 6 feet. This seems kind of arbitrary to me. Like, what's the significance of 6? Like, if someone coughs or sneezes, the virus goes out 5 feet 11 inches and suddenly stops?
And grocery stores and public transportation aren't the only locations in which that can happen. Even just walking outside or waiting for an elevator could expose you to someone else.
Well, it's not like anything you're saying here is unique to COVID. I mean, anytime you're within proximity to other people, you're potentially exposing yourself to a wide variety of diseases, not just COVID. Look, at the end of the day, life involves risk. Anytime you leave your home, there's going to be things involving risks to your health and safety. Heck, even in your home, there's things that involve risk to your health and safety. Being exposed to risk is just an ordinary, unavoidable part of life. Now, because you can't avoid risk completely, and because there's no objective, correct amount of risk to assume, everyone should just be a responsible adult and decide for themselves what level of risk they're willing to take. Some people might decide that the risk of getting ill is worth, having fun and going to social events. Other people might not feel that way. Some people might be comfortable around others. Other people might only be comfortable around others if they're wearing a mask. There's no such such thing as an objective right or wrong level of risk to accept. This is why it should be up to individuals and their personal responsibility to make these types of decisions. Some people might be stupid and make bad decisions, but I'd argue even in those cases, the right tool for the job is to educate, to get these people in a position where they can make responsible decisions, not to take away their freedom and self-autonomy.
And it's not like we're asking for a lot.
You're not asking for anything. These are mask mandates, they're orders, they're directives from the government. If you refuse, there's a gun. Now granted, a lot of mask advocates are also advocating for voluntary compliance. A lot of people support wearing masks but don't think they should be required by the government, and hey, I'm cool with that. If you think wearing a mask is the right thing to do and you want to try and convince people to do it voluntarily, I'm all in support of that. What I'm against is if you want to go to the government and say, point a gun at him and make him wear a mask even if he doesn't want to.
Literally just a piece of fabric that covers your nose and mouth. And over this, people are throwing hissy fits. Now, I could understand somewhat if it was mandatory to wear heavy gas masks, but this is literally a piece of fabric. What kind of personal liberties is this infringing? I don't understand how some people could take something so small and think it's taking away something from them. It's ridiculous.
So when people point out that complying with the government mask mandates isn't particularly burdensome, they're kind of missing the point entirely. Yeah, sure, maybe it isn't particularly burdensome to comply when the government orders you to wear a mask. But it also wouldn't be particularly burdensome if the government orders you to wear a tutu, or a hat, or a cape, or a mask and snorkel, whatever. The question is, if the government orders me to wear something, why am I obligated to comply? As a libertarian, I believe that everybody owns themselves, therefore you own your body, therefore you decide what to wear on it. If the government can order you to wear something against your will and you have no recourse in the matter, what that essentially implies is that the government, at least to some extent, owns your body. And well, if I have no right to say no to being forced to wear a regular cloth mask, why would I have any right to say no to being forced to wear a gas mask or a heavy respirator or some shit like that? And that's why these mask mandates are causing people to be concerned about civil liberties. Not even necessarily because it's particularly burdensome to wear a cloth mask, but because it sets the precedent that the government can force you to wear shit. And if that's a precedent you're willing to set, then why stop at a cloth mask? Heck, Fauci even talked about forcing people to wear goggles too at one point, which actually led to this really funny joke where a guy actually walked into a coffee shop wearing a freaking scuba mask and snorkel. I'll put a link to it in the description, it's kind of funny.
It's do as we say or else.
It's not for your own good, it's for everyone else's.
Oh boy, here we go again, the rhetoric about how the mask doesn't protect you, it protects those around you. This is commonly used as a rhetorical strategy to try and strawman people who criticize mask mandates as selfish, not caring about others.
I never held the belief that people who don't want to wear masks don't care about others, and that's because it's difficult for you to firsthand see the consequences of your actions here. If you're going around spreading the virus to other people and you never see them again, then they die from it a week later, you can't really feel the consequences of you not wearing a mask. It can't really be traced back to you and you never know about the death. That's just the nature of the situation. But of course, if you were given a knife and were asked to stab someone to death, I'm sure you wouldn't do it. Wearing a mask is equivalent to putting that knife down, but it doesn't feel like they have the same magnitude because you're never there to witness the consequences of the former situation. So it's not necessarily because people don't care about others, they just can't see the full picture. Now, if you work in science and work in data, it's easier to broaden your view and see things from a grand perspective, which is why scientists around the world are all proponents of mask wearing.
But more often than not, that's the intention. So I should start by pointing out that some of the criticisms that I make in this video are more directed toward the pro-mask crowd in general, and not to Professor Stick specifically. So because of that, some of the arguments that I make may come across to him as straw men. Now, truth be told, perhaps I should have made this a little more clear in the video, and perhaps I'll take responsibility for that, but just something to be aware of from this point forward. So the first thing to point out here is that what I was basically saying was that this type of rhetoric, oh, the mask doesn't protect you, it protects those around you, is often used as a blanket way to just strawman anyone who criticizes mask mandates. Like, I argue that I want to get the government to fuck off my face, and people will respond by saying, well, you just want to kill grandma, don't you? Like, I haven't heard that argument a million times before. Now, I do duly acknowledge that this isn't always the case. Not everyone uses this rhetoric in that manner. I duly acknowledge that Professor Stick may very well not have this intention in mind. However, it is frustrating to hear this type of rhetoric thrown around time and time again whenever you criticize mask mandates. And the second important thing to point out here is that I'm not criticizing masks, I'm criticizing mask mandates. Like, yeah, sure, it may very well be the case that wearing a mask keeps you or those around you safe, and if that's the case, then sure, I'm all for wearing them. But pointing out that there are health benefits to wearing masks doesn't necessarily defeat my criticism, since what I'm arguing against isn't wearing masks in and of themselves, but forcing people who don't want to wear masks to wear them. And the third thing to point out here, and this is the important one, not everyone who criticizes mask mandates is coming from a position of selfishness. There's actually a variety of reasons someone may be critical of mask mandates. It could be that the data and facts regarding the effectiveness of masks is kind of mixed. It could be that there are disadvantages to forcing everybody to wear masks, as I point out several times in my video. Just because someone doesn't agree with mask mandates doesn't automatically mean that they're selfish or they don't care about other people or whatever. And if you think about it, are the people who criticize mask mandates really the selfish ones? I mean, you're the one who wants the government to point guns at people to force them to wear something they don't want to against their will, because the entire world is just obligated to revolve around your specific idea of what an ideal level of risk should be.
People are being required to wear regular masks, not the N95 ones. Regular masks protect you from spreading the virus to other people, but it's not really effective at protecting yourself.
Actually, there is some research that suggests that even plain surgical masks can be effective at protecting the wearer as well as those around them.
Yes, I agree, masks are effective in both directions. But there's a nuance here. When modeling the effectiveness of masks, it's easy to look at the virus as free-floating particles that come into contact with the mask, in which case it is the same effectiveness in terms of protection in both directions. However, COVID is not like that and is transferred more through respiratory droplets rather than airborne. Of course, there is some good preliminary evidence that this virus can be airborne, but for the majority of time it rests on water particles. So yes, surgical masks can protect the wearer to some degree, one that is less significant than protecting others, however. But what I said in my original video goes a bit further and I simplified a bit. Either way, I don't see how pointing that out helps your argument.
Well, first of all, it's just kind of putting that out as a general fact. I mean, I can point out general facts and tidbits of information in my video. Not everything I say necessarily has to support what I'm arguing. But a general theme you're going to notice here in a minute in this video is that a lot of the mask shaming rhetoric rests on the premise that your mask protects others from you and there's no way for people to protect themselves. If it's possible for a mask to protect the wearer, then your whole justification for forcing me to wear a mask against my will kind of falls apart. I mean, just think about it for a minute. If you're a surgeon who's performing an operation on somebody, you're cutting open and dealing with the inside of a person's body. You're dealing with all different sorts of fluids, bacteria, Lord knows what. And while you probably don't want to infect the patient, you would probably also want the mask to prevent the patient from infecting you.
No, that's simply wrong.
Whoa, hold on a minute there. Just a moment ago, you agreed with me that plain surgical masks can offer protection in both directions. Now you're backtracking and saying that's wrong?
The surgical masks that surgeons wear are to protect the patient. It is to keep the area as sanitary as possible. Before a surgery occurs, the room is cleaned and disinfected as much as possible. Doctors have to scrub in, which is a whole procedure in and of itself, before entering the surgical room. Then they wear surgical masks because their own saliva and droplets can potentially infect the patient. When you're cut open, you're susceptible to all sorts of infections and invasions. That's one thing that your skin is supposed to prevent, and that is, of course, something that people take for granted. When you're cut open, you are incredibly susceptible, which is why the surgeon needs to wear a surgical mask. That is the primary reason.
Well, yes, I'm aware that's the primary reason. Everything you just said, I am perfectly well aware of. At no point did I ever argue that surgical masks don't protect the patient from the surgeon. I was simply positing that they do in fact protect the other direction as well. Just because the surgical mask is primarily designed to protect the patient doesn't necessarily mean that the mask doesn't protect the surgeon either.
Now, what about the other way around? Is the surgeon trying to protect him or herself? You see, unless the patient is already pre-infected with something, which the doctor would already know about, by the way, the inside of a human body can be surprisingly clean. And even if they are infected, your skin does a fantastic job of keeping it out of your body. So you just have to be careful of ingesting any fluids from the patient. That's not a job for the surgical mask.
Alright, so a couple things to say here. First of all, surgeons often probably do operate on infected people. Like if someone's in need of life-saving operation immediately, but just so happens to also have the flu, I don't think the surgeon's going to stand there like, you know what, he's sick, I'd rather wait for him to get better before I operate on him. And even if that specific patient that the surgeon is operating on isn't infected, there's a good chance that there's other infected people in that hospital that the surgeon could be in proximity of. Because I'm not sure if you've ever been to a hospital before, but there tends to be a lot of sick people there. And it's not like it's just the surgeons who wear these masks. Pretty much all the staff across the entire hospital wear these same masks. A lot of these staff expose to the sick people more than the surgeon. Now, since a hospital would be pretty useless if its staff were constantly getting sick all the time, it would probably be safe to assume that these masks do provide at least somewhat protection in the other direction. I'm also noticing some inconsistencies here. On the one hand, he argues that because the skin is so good at blocking out pathogens from the patient, typically surgeons don't need to worry about protecting themselves. So clearly he believes that the skin is a very good line of defense for the body against pathogens, but yet at the same time COVID-19 is just so utterly deadly and destructive that we all have to wear masks. Is COVID fluid somehow permeable through the skin the way these other pathogens aren't? Another problem here is that he makes the argument that the only thing the surgeon really has to worry about is ingesting fluids from the patient, which the surgical mask isn't designed to protect against. But on the other hand, he argues that the reason that surgical masks are so effective is because they block saliva droplets, which saliva is a fluid, so it seemed like the masks simultaneously do and don't block fluids, which is kind of strange. But ultimately, this seems like kind of a redundant point for him to get all hung up on. I mean, whether or not the masks actually do protect in both directions, in either scenario, the mask is still protecting other people from you, which seems to be what Professor Stick is primarily concerned about. So it's not like the masks actually protecting in both directions would be that consequential to his argument. Think about it for a minute. If you were in a medical profession, if you were around people who are sick or dealing with all different types of tissues, fluids, Lord knows what, and you were handed a mask and told, here, it protects them but not you, I'd be like, no thank you.
You make a whole speech about a straw man of claiming people not wearing masks as not caring about other people. And then you give us a hypothetical example of exactly you not caring about other people. I'm not the type to go around claiming other people are selfish, but your statement here is a clear example of that. And to answer your question, of course I would fucking wear a mask if I were working in the medical field and was told it protects the patient.
Mr. Strawman, give me a break.
Wow, that's a really dishonest portrayal of what I was arguing there. He basically contorted what I said and removed important pieces of context to try and construe that as me being selfish or not caring about others. Yeah, of course, if I was in a medical profession, I'd want to wear a mask that protects the patients, but there's an important bit of context you left out there, buddy. The mask only protects the patients from me, not the other way around. By leaving out this bit of context, you can make it seem as if the reason I was rejecting the mask was because it protects other people, and therefore you could strawman me as selfish. The reason I'd be saying no thank you to that mask isn't because it protects other people, it's because it doesn't protect me. I wouldn't reject the mask, say fuck it, and just go around infecting people. I would rather ask for a mask that protects in both directions, which honestly doesn't seem that unreasonable for a doctor to ask for. I mean, I don't see how it's selfish for the doctor to expect that the mask protect him as well as the patients. Like what, is the doctor's health any less important than the health of the patients around him? Doesn't he have the same right to expect his health, safety, and well-being as everyone else? And you could also make the argument that a mask that protects the doctor as well is also beneficial to the patients, and a mask only protects the patients. Because if that doctor were to get sick and have to call out, that hospital would be short a staff member. So best case scenario, that doctor gets sick and the hospital's shorthanded by a member. Worst case scenario, that doctor could end up becoming a patient himself and even contribute to that hospital's workload. With this in mind, it could very well be the case that it's actually not a selfish thing for the doctor to ask for a two-directional mask. What, is a firefighter selfish because he wants to wear flame retardant gear? Are police officers and soldiers selfish because they want bulletproof armor? Is a scuba diver selfish because he wants an oxygen tank? Because it's just as dumb. It's just as fucking dumb.
The idea is that if everyone is wearing the mask, then everyone is protected. You are protected from the fact that others are wearing the mask. So you have to also do your part and protect other people from you.
So when people argue that everyone has to be wearing a mask in order for the masks to work, this is essentially an admission that the masks are basically worthless. Because even if that were true, that everyone had to be wearing a mask in order for them to be effective, there's basically no chance in hell of that ever happening. The government does not have the resources to monitor every single person constantly to make sure that they're wearing a mask.
Of course, you can't possibly enforce this to every person in the country. That'd be ridiculous. But you're acting as if this is an all or nothing type of scenario. It's not that either 100% of the people wear masks and everyone is protected, or less than 100% wear masks and no one is protected. The more people that wear masks, the less spread there is, and the less cases of COVID there will be. There's plenty of gray area. We want to control this spread as much as possible. And to do that, we need to get as many people to wear masks as possible. 50% is better than 30%, for example. Just because we can't get every single person to wear masks doesn't mean we can't try to mitigate the damage by encouraging more mask usage. This is such a dumb argument.
So here's the thing, I do value intellectual honesty. I can admit when I'm wrong or when I make a bad argument. And truth be told, this is probably a bit of an exaggeration on my part. Well sure, maybe it is a bit inaccurate to frame it as if it's a binary issue, as if either everybody has to wear masks in order to be effective, or if just one person's not wearing a mask, then they all lose their effectiveness. Sure, I'll admit maybe that's a bit of an inaccurate way of framing the issue. But even if I were to make this concession, I feel a lot of the other points I make still stand. In particular, my point regarding whether it's more effective to pursue voluntary compliance or government coercion. Because, as I've said throughout this entire video, my problem is not with masks, it's with mask mandates.
It's not a controlling thing. It's not a power thing.
So if this really is about genuine concern over health rather than just being a power grab, why are people being required to wear the inferior mask that only protects in one direction? I don't know about you, but if I was concerned about people's health and there were two types of masks, one only protects in one direction, the other protects in both directions, I would probably be supporting the mask that protects in both directions, no?
I love how you say, if I was concerned about people's health, basically admitting you don't.
So this fallacy is called logic chopping. It's basically when you try and attach meaning to every little word a person says, to the point that you're just wholly distracted from the main issue at hand. When I said, if I care about other people's health, in no way was that intended to affirm or deny whether or not I do care about other people's health. I was simply trying to explain what would logically follow from caring about other people's health. Of course I care about people's health and well-being. A lot of the arguments I'm making this video are predicated upon people's health and well-being. Watch any of my videos where I argue against lockdowns and I go into full detail on all the destruction they're having on people's happiness, their lives, their well-being, their health. You know, I'm actually kind of shocked with how many underhanded and dishonest tactics this guy's using. Like, this is supposed to be the smart, sciencey guy, isn't he not?
Well, whatever. I don't know where you've been or why you're so disconnected with the world, but there are good reasons why we don't enforce N95 masks. Firstly, because they are much shorter in supply. So when they are in short supply, the healthcare workers will have priority over them. For common civilians, not only are they not as exposed to the virus as healthcare workers, but regular surgical masks do the job just fine. Of course, if somehow we had enough N95 masks for every single person in the country and could supply more if needed, then of course having them wear N95 masks would reduce the spread of the pandemic. But sadly, that's just not the case. Surgical masks, however, are in decent supply and are pretty good at doing what they do. And then on top of that, they are also a lot more comfortable, so people would be willing to wear them. That's the reality of the situation.
So I've actually done some research on the availability of N95 masks versus plain surgical masks. What I've found is that there really isn't that big of a difference in terms of availability between the two. I've looked across several different major online retailers such as Amazon, eBay, and Walmart, and what I found was that while the N95 masks might be slightly more expensive, there's no major difference in terms of availability. Heck, freaking Home Depot sells N95 masks, so it's hardly like there's some kind of precious commodity. But even if there was some kind of massive shortage of N95 masks. To an extent, the very big government that Professor Stick wants to ride in on a white horse and save us from this pandemic is largely responsible for that shortage. Because early on in this pandemic, when medical workers were freaking out over shortages of masks and stuff, people actually figured out how to 3D print the N95 masks. So a lot of people were 3D printing these N95 masks, getting ready to distribute them. Well, guess what? The government stepped in and said, nope, patent infringement, and besides, you wouldn't actually need N95 masks for every single person in the country. You'd really only need them for either medical workers or people who are particularly vulnerable to the virus, such as the elderly. Because since the N95 mask protects the wearer, they don't have to worry about asymptomatic people spreading it around to them. Because while I don't deny that these surgical masks are good at what they do, the people being forced to wear these surgical masks are largely asymptomatic. That is, even if they do have the virus, it's not going to affect them. So looking at this from a purely logistical standpoint, it would be much simpler to manage distributing masks that protect the wearer to people who are vulnerable than to try and distribute masks that protect people other than the wearer to everybody. He also argues that surgical masks are more comfortable than N95 masks and therefore be easier to get compliance. This point's kind of dicey to me though. I mean, isn't comfort subjective? And just as surgical masks come in many different shapes and sizes, so do N95 masks. I mean, just type in N95 mask in Amazon and you'll see all different sort of shapes, sizes, styles, etc. So it doesn't seem accurate to me to just blanket say, well, these types of masks are more comfortable.
I mean, what's next? Requiring people to wear clothing and not to be naked in public spaces is also some sort of do what we say or else?
Well, again, like I said before, private property owners have the right to set the terms and conditions of the use of their property.
Being naked in public is illegal in many parts of the United States already. Are you going to write a speech about why that is taking away your personal liberties? Instead of answering the question, you're just going on about private property again. The fact of the matter is, there is law against it in public spaces.
Hey pal, you just blowing from Stupid Town?
So either this guy's dense as bricks, or he's intentionally taking my arguments out of context. There's a specific reason I discussed private property rights multiple times in the video, and he doesn't seem to be going into that. You know, major aspects of my argumentation that he's just skipping right the fuck over. You see, in the minds of people like Professor Stick, there's pro-maskers and anti-maskers, and that's the end of the story. Whereas I'm looking at this issue through the lens of nuance. You know, people are unique, situations are unique, circumstances are unique, environments are unique. Whereas people people like Professor Stick see the issue as masks are always the answer or never the answer, my approach is more sometimes masks are the answer, sometimes they're not. So when I say something like private property owners have the right to require masks as a condition of using their property, they shouldn't be required to, but if they want to, they're within that purview. That doesn't fit within Professor Stick's whole binary of pro-mask versus anti-mask, so of course he'd have to leave that out or not discuss it in detail. Now, with regards to public nudity laws specifically, like not even 30 seconds later, I actually do discuss what my opinion on public nudity laws is, and he just kind of leaves that out. He acts as if I never addressed that issue when I clearly did if you watch the original video. And usually, I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. I don't like to immediately assume that intentionally remove context. I like to think maybe they overlooked it by accident. But this happens like 10 seconds later, and it's pretty hard to miss, so there's no way this can be an honest accidental omission. He says that I never addressed the issue of public nudity laws when I very clearly do.
When you wear gloves that transfer disease everywhere, those gloves have bacteria all over them. I'm wearing gloves. Not helping you.
What this doctor's saying right now is actually completely true. You see, gloves keep things sanitary only up to a certain point. At a certain point, the gloves become so saturated with bacteria and grime that you're actually spreading it around and making things less sanitary by wearing the gloves.
Yes, certainly. No one disagrees with that. The thing is, gloves in hospitals have to be constantly renewed. You don't just wear a single pair for an entire day and not change them at all. I used to work in laboratory research in hospital settings, and gloves are always being changed. There's even a small procedure to follow on how to properly remove your gloves so that contaminated parts don't come into contact with your skin. So what Dr. Erickson said here is useless, and I'm sure we can agree on that.
You may have noticed a particular pattern at this point. This guy keeps saying that arguments are useless or don't mean anything without actually explaining why that's the case. And when you do that, it seems like you're just using that for intellectual cover instead of actually addressing the argument. Formerly, the fallacy of dismissing arguments without explanation is known as ad lapidem or appeal to the stone. And well, guess what? The same thing goes for masks. Masks are effective at preventing the spread of pathogens from the breath that you exhale. That is, until the mask becomes saturated with those pathogens. Now the mask becomes a spreader of those pathogens.
You're misrepresenting reality here. If masks are not properly cleaned or replaced, then they become less effective. But unless you're licking the mask, it's not necessarily going to work in the opposite direction. Of course, you have to be smart about it. If you're not replacing your mask, don't wear it as if it's going to be nearly as effective. I agree that most people in the common public is not going to wash their cloth mask or replace their surgical masks after each session like they should. But that's not going to make things worse like you're implying. Even if the mask is replaced or washed only every so often, it's still better to wear a mask than not wearing one at all.
So he claims that I'm misrepresenting reality by pointing this out, but am I really though? The issue of masks becoming saturated with pathogens and spreading them around was actually brought up in an episode of Tom Wood's podcast where he was discussing with a doctor about masks and their effectiveness. Because when you're wearing a mask constantly 24/7 every moment of your life, as people seem to advocate for, that mask picks up pathogens pretty quickly. And of course, once the mask is like fully saturated with those pathogens and you're continuing to breathe through it, what you're actually doing is you're forcing those pathogens out of the mask. So it goes from blocking them to just sort of periodically spritzing them out everywhere. If you want more details on this, I have a link to the Tom Woods podcast in the description. Now, it seems like he does agree with me in general that it's better to replace these masks every so often or wash them or whatever. And this sort of has to do with the issue I brought up before. Is it better to seek voluntary compliance or government mandate? Because if people are only wearing the masks because they have to, just for permission to go in a grocery store or whatever, and outside of that they could give a two fucks about masks, what are the chances that they're going to actually go through the effort of replacing them or washing them like they should be? See, if we educate people on the benefits of wearing masks and get them to wear it voluntarily, it's much more likely that they would take into account this sort of nuance here.
It's funny how you're playing a clip from Dr. Erickson when he was debunked by so many other scientists and healthcare providers.
No links provided to any of these so-called debunkings in the description, just throwing that out there.
Sure, I didn't link anything in the description, but this was all over social media when it came out. You'd have to be living under a rock to not see all the criticisms. I also work with doctors a lot since I actually am one of the administrators and data managers for a COVID clinical trial. But for those who don't get as much exposure to scientists and doctors like I do, simply keeping up with social media was enough to know.
Well, first of all, social media is kind of a broad category. I mean, you have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, Discord, WhatsApp, etc., etc. Just saying, well, this was on social media, so you should have known about it, you stupid plebe, isn't really helpful. I'm not necessarily knocking him for not putting it in the description. I mean, it would have been helpful, especially to someone like me. You know, I work 2 jobs and make videos, so sorry I don't necessarily have the time to heavily invest in following social media. But when I mention sources or perhaps useful bits of information that may be helpful in getting my point across, I do make it a point to put it in my description. You know, it's just not necessarily you have to do that, but it's good practice.
Maybe to regular people who know nothing about science, what he says may seem legit at first. I assume you're part of that category of knowing nothing about science since you're playing the clip in your video. But if you're a biologist like me, or if you've studied any sort of high school science, it's pretty easy to recognize a lot of the nonsense Dr. Erickson is spewing here.
You see, the left has a very strange way of portraying science. They speak of it as if it's this monolithic body of knowledge that you either understand or you don't.
I'm literally a scientist. Don't even try to categorize me as, quote, the left.
Yeah, buddy, I'm aware that you're a scientist. That's not news to me at all, but you're also on the left. Those aren't mutually exclusive. You can be a scientist and be on the left. You can be a scientist and be on the right. You can be a scientist and be anywhere on the political spectrum. And it's not me trying to categorize you as left, it's you who's trying to categorize you as left. You said in one of your videos you politically identify as more liberal, so you let that cat out of the bag, not me.
It's just a generalization. And as a scientist, I'm certain I have a better understanding of what science is and its processes than you do.
Whoa, hold on a second there, buddy. I thought scientists weren't supposed to just jump to conclusions and declare that they're certain about something. Now, I may not be a scientist myself, but it does seem kind of unscientific for you to just jump to conclusions like that without taking any sort of additional information into account. You don't really know my education history or my employment background or what sort of studying I've done before. And just because I'm not officially a scientist doesn't mean I don't know anything about science or its processes. One discipline that I've studied profusely both in college and in my personal time is philosophy. And there's a branch of philosophy called Epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. It's an entire branch of philosophy that's just dedicated to empirical judgments about reality. So the kind of ironic thing here is that by making the claim that I know nothing about science, without any additional information to substantiate that, he essentially usurped his very own scientific method that he regularly practices.
And isn't it ironic?
They seem to argue as if you have credentials in one particular field of science, you suddenly know everything there is to know about science.
Literally nobody claims that, and if there is someone who did, then that person is delusional. For me, I'm a biologist, so I certainly can speak to the pandemic, thank you very much. Nice straw man, by the way.
Well, like I said earlier in this video, some of my criticisms weren't directed toward Professor Stick specifically, some of them were directed more towards the COVID hysteria in general. And I like how on the one hand this guy says that he doesn't identify with the left, but on the other hand when I make a criticism regarding the left, he automatically assumes that I'm trying to apply that criticism to him. And yeah, I get that you're a biologist, but biology is kind of a broad field. You could be a botanist, a zoologist, a virologist, a geneticist. Even just saying you're a biologist doesn't necessarily mean that we know you have all the acumen necessary to give us accurate comments on the pandemic. Heck, even if this guy did specialize specifically in virology and immunology, it wouldn't necessarily give him all the credentials he needs to comment on the pandemic. Because pandemics are kind of complex issues. Like sure, someone who specializes in microbiology or virology might be able to explain how the virus spreads or how quickly it spreads, but what are the consequences of that virus spreading? What are the long-term social and economic consequences of locking down the way people suggest that we do? That involves a lot of acumen regarding economics, finance, sociology, things that simply knowing the mechanisms of the virus specifically aren't going to reveal to you. Or if you happen to make a scientific argument that they disagree with, they'll jump to the conclusion that you're ignorant about any and all science whatsoever.
I certainly can't speak for other people, but when I claim people don't understand science, they actually don't understand science. These people make ignorant claims all the time and think that what they believe is somehow more credible than data generated from actual scientific research. Not saying you fall under that category, but you making that claim just now makes me think you might be one of those people.
So here's basically the point I was trying to get across there. Just because someone makes a scientific argument that you disagree with, or that you feel is inaccurate or wrong or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean that they're ignorant about science as a whole. Because science is kind of a broad category of things. You know, someone might say something wrong about biology, but be an expert in physics, you know? And the thing is, people can understand science and still be wrong. Heck, the ability to admit when you're wrong is like the hallmark of science. Now, of course, if someone is actually wrong and there's evidence that proves them wrong, staring them straight in the face, but they still insist that they're right, then maybe that person is being ignorant of science. Sure, perhaps you could make that argument. But one of the things that frustrates me in particular is when people will act like all the science and all the medical community is like all on a consensus, and that anyone who has any data or facts that deviate from this at all is a crackpot who doesn't know what they're talking about. Not saying that this applies to Professor Stick specifically, but I know a lot of people have this preconceived narrative in mind of what the right answers are. Yes, we need lockdowns. Yes, we need masks. Yes, COVID is extremely deadly. And if anyone publishes any data that veers from that even slightly, they're labeled a crackpot. Even if they only disagree with the mainstream narrative slightly, that's enough for people to dismiss it as hogwash. And I think the reaction I got on my original mask video more or less proves this. If you watch my original video that Professor Stick responds to, you'll see it's not really all that anti-mask. I'm not even necessarily disagreeing with the facts and data that Professor Stick is putting forward. I'm just sort of criticizing the conclusions he draws from it. It really wasn't an anti-mask video. At no point in the video did I ever tell anyone to or not to wear a mask. All I did was tell people to look at the information on both sides and make the decision for themselves. And just for that reason alone, just because I had the audacity to tell people to think for themselves, the video was just swarmed with angry comments, calling me selfish, anti-masker, this and that. So because I deviated from the narrative just that much, I got all that backlash from it. And I think that more or less proves the point I'm getting across here.
Okay, so the next part he plays a clip of me explaining basic immunology and then admits he doesn't understand it, which is fine. I won't criticize people for admitting that.
Yeah, I can admit when I don't know all the relevant facts and information. It's called being intellectually honest. And I never necessarily said that I don't understand anything about immunology. Yeah, of course I understand the basics of how white blood cells and T cells work. Heck, I've used basic facts about human immunology as a premise to several of my other arguments I've made on COVID-19. Yeah, I know the basics of how human immunology works, but I was saying it's not a field I have expertise in. I haven't spent years of my life studying and researching it. But even if I did, even if I was an expert on human immunology, I would still only recommend masks as a voluntary measure. I wouldn't advocate that it be imposed onto people. Because even if I'm an expert in health, it's still your decision at the end of the day. Your health is your decision. Science just gives us the is. It's up to you to figure out the ought.
But that goes to show you why listening to experts is important. They understand things that you don't, so their advice is more valuable than a layman's. So when infectious disease experts around the world are recommending mask wearing, it's probably a good idea to listen to them.
Well, yeah, of course I'm not against people referring to the opinions of experts. I mean, of course it would be unreasonable to expect everyone to have all the acumen they need to make all the decisions in their life. But yeah, trust me, I work IT help desk, I know firsthand. So of course I'm not against turning toward the opinion of experts when you may not understand an issue yourself. But what I advocate for is that people approach it with intellectual honesty. You see, there's a lot of different experts out there on any given issue giving out all different kinds of data. Sometimes experts will agree on things, other times they'll disagree on things. Of course, you don't have to agree with every single thing that every expert says. As a matter of fact, you shouldn't, because at the end of the day, experts are humans just like us. They're wrong sometimes. But when you're seeking the opinion of experts, look at experts across the board. Don't just look at the pro-mask or anti-mask experts. Look at both of them. Get the whole picture, basically, is what I'm saying. Scrutinize the arguments that experts make just as you would any other argument made by a layman. Don't add extra weight to it just because it's from an expert. That's called the appeal to authority fallacy. And again, like I said before, I don't mind experts issuing mask recommendations. If they think masks are good for protecting people's health and want to encourage people to wear them, hey, I'm cool with that. Just don't have the government put a gun to the back of my head and say put on a mask or else. That's it. And that's really all the more I have to say right now. It looks like this guy did release a part 2 earlier today, so at some point I'll probably have to tackle that as well. Yeah, hope everyone enjoys their new year and take care.
Fuck the mask order and the new world order. Fuck the mask order and the new world order. Fuck the mask order and the new world order. Hang the pedal politicians and their Satan.